Well, so many of you heard my talk last year, and the reason I was here a year ago was to start on a new project that I had, because I guess what I want to tell you is when I left Silicon Valley, I had left largely because I'd become I left because Tom gave us a phone call and he said, we have something developing over here and we need your help, namely grandchildren, all right? And so that's why I left. But as I was leaving, well, I'll get to that part. But before I left, once I donated the $100,000 that Arthur said, and I'd been president for quite a while, at that point. But it became very important that I stepped back from leadership because we'd hired an executive director who was a wonderful, wonderful person, Bill Jacobson, and he really needed to be the leader at that time. And so I needed to do things. And then I ran into various problems at work and one thing and another. And so with one thing and another, I had stepped back from being as active in humanism other than giving an occasional talk. And I started to realize that, I really didn't care about high tech. I really didn't. That I was extremely good at it. But I didn't care. And that what I cared about is I said, look, what I have discovered in working here with the humanist community is that the world needs organized humanism. It needs us. If the world were the way we were, Trump would never have been elected. Okay? And however, not that our getting stronger would really have prevented it, but at any rate, but the world still needs us, and they need us to be a lot stronger, both within our communities, our humanist communities, and the strength of those communities can then help with politics, okay? And it's with the greater strength at the political level, then we can cause all kinds of wonderful things to happen in our world and prevent all kinds of other horrible things from happening. But so anyway, but I realized that for me personally, I really wasn't a high-tech person, and I really wasn't a clergy person like Bill Jacobson. I realized, I am a philosopher. That's what I am, to my very core. So I decided to transition out of high-tech into philosophy. While I was out here, one of the things that it turns out that Florence Tarbox, who was heavily involved in our Sunday school, her husband was involved in Civil War reenactment. And so he'd got me all involved in Civil War reenactment, but the way he did it was very much as living history. And so he was just really strong on the living history part of Civil War reenactment. So he got me involved. And I got both of my boys involved because at that point, the draft was over. I'm sitting here saying, I believe in universal military service so that you learn about the military, because the citizens need to know about the military. And so the only way the best I could do to teach my kids about the military was get them involved in Civil War reenactment. They learned a little bit. It's a lot better than cowboys and Indians, but it's not the same, obviously. But doing it as living history taught me a lot about history and about the history of 19th century America, because guess when the Civil War was? 19th century, all right? As a matter of fact, one of the things I did in my Civil War reenactment is I took a copy of The Origin of Species with me, because The Origin of Species had just been published at the beginning of the Civil War, and all the soldiers, and if you've ever seen the movie Gettysburg, they have the soldiers in the movie Gettysburg talking about the theory of evolution over the campfire. So that was a big topic at the time, and so so that's one of the things that I did, to combine my humanism and my Civil War reenactment. But But I'm a very unusual humanist. And one of the reasons I'm a very unusual humanist is I am a very strong religious humanist. Now, what on earth do I mean by that? And what I mean by that is, my mother has written an actual humanist religious text that begins, "Behold, I have forsaken in my heart the deities of all my ancient kin. The arcs they carved are molded, strewn apart. No present faith may be contained therein." And so she goes on and shows how we are standing on the shoulders of everyone who came before, but we believe in science, and we believe in evolution, and we believe in technology, and whatnot. And so that is the kind of religious humanist that I am, all right? So as I started working as a philosopher, one of the first things I had to discover as a philosopher is just come to terms with what on earth is religion. Because that was, I knew that, hey, I've got lots of friends who are, and as a matter of fact, a big problem in organized humanism right now is that too many of us think that humanism should not be considered to be a religion, right? And I think that this is completely wrong. It turns out that among the Unitarians, among most of the liberal religions in the United States, most of them believe that theology does not come from the top down. They all believe that theology comes from the bottom up. And so it starts at the congregation, and the congregations form together, and then the denomination has to reflect the theology of the congregations. Okay? And that's because, why? Because in the Enlightenment, what we learned, and what we as humanists really believe, is that rather than having any specific set of ideas that you believe in, what you really believe in is thinking for yourself. And so when I wrote my creed, one of my big experiences I had is based on the 10 Points of Naturalistic Humanism from Corliss Lamont's book. But when I published that, I was flabbergasted at how few people picked up on it, okay? Because I thought I'd done a really good job of creating an artistic and even more expressive declaration of the 10 Points of Naturalistic Humanism than Corliss Lamont had in his book. And so I was just flabbergasted. And so as I looked at that, I said, well, wait a minute. This is my creed. And I have to say, I wrote it in the late 70s, and my wife and I wrote it together. I still like my creed. I still think that is great. But I know that lots of other people really don't want to pick it up. They don't want to repeat it. They don't want to learn it. There are advantages to doing that, but if you're not going to do it, then you're not going to, and we're thinking for ourselves, and so I fully support thinking for yourself, and if you don't want to recite my creed, fine, don't recite my creed, okay? But it's credo, I believe, okay? Okay. So what I discovered is that the essence, what is the difference between science and religion? And the difference is that in science we are completely concerned about the world outside of ourselves. We know that that operates by natural law, and we want to know what that natural law is. And as we get further and further along in the advance of science, we have to get more and more skilled at the objective thinking that divorces us from what we want and all our subjective being, and allows us to become more and more accurate in our observations of the natural world and our theories of how does all that work. Whereas in religion really is not about that at all. And this becomes very clear when you're in the semiconductor industry and you notice that there are no ministers in the fab. And let me tell you, when you are making a chip, one of the big problems is most of those chips don't work because there's been some tiny little flaw in the process. And so when you're manufacturing semiconductors, half of the problem is how on earth do you test them, because you know you're going to have to throw most of them away. and especially for the microprocessors, the biggest ones, and the ones with the most transistors in them, because the more transistors they have, the more likely they are to not work when you make them, all right? Because there's been some tiny little flaw in the manufacturing process. So you test them, and you keep the good ones, and you throw away the ones that don't work. And so you're living right on the edge of what is known. And if you're thinking, well, gee whiz, if we're concerned about whether we're going to live or die, we really want to pray about it, okay? Then if that's your attitude, then you definitely want the clergy in the fab, because that's where you say, wait a minute, I want these chips to work, okay? But nobody does that. Nobody does it. And why? Because religious people really don't care about the world outside. What do they care about? They care about living from a subjective point of view, okay? And so once I realized that this was the essence of religion, then the big issue that we have with them is we say, well, wait a minute, it's strategies of life that we disagree with them on. And my mother, in her poem, she lays out very clearly, with many a tale of Adam's guilty feast, Pandora's, Faustus, and Prometheus' fall, they warned that wit is daughter to the beast, flesh of the earthbound flesh that clothes us all. They thought by faith the demon to forestall, nor could they fathom nature's strict decree that whether good or dreaded ill befall, this human flesh must think, must probe, must see that from this fate no God, no faith can set us free. All right? So that's our disagreement with the other religions, okay? That they say, no, 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 we do not trust it when you think for yourselves. We want you following what we have to say. And we say, excuse me, we're going to think for ourselves. And we are going to find out what's going on, and no one is going to stop us. All right, well, at any rate. So I arrive in D.C., and it turns out that the way I got there is I've been at the National AHA conference in Washington, D.C., which is a joint meeting with the International Humanist and Ethical Union. And I sat down at this dinner table and I was telling them about my creed and kinds of stuff like that. And I'm saying, you know what, I'm very much of a religious humanist, and I'm realizing I'm a philosopher and stuff, and so I really want to study with Rabbi Sherwin-Wine, because I consider Rabbi Sherwin-Wine to be the preeminent religious humanist of the late 20th century. And I'm sitting there, and the guy I'm talking to is this guy named Marvin Rosenblum, and he says, oh, well, you're out of luck. He just died in an automobile accident last year, and that's why I'm sitting here, and as Marvin, this is Marvin Rosenblum speaking, I'm sitting here, and now I'm the president of the International Federation of Secular and Humanistic Judaism. And so the two of us just chat, and I say, and so we talk very friendly for a while. The next morning he calls me up on the phone. He says, Peter, I thought it through. I want you to join me at the International Federation. I say, well, I have one requirement. You have to put humanist philosopher in my title. He says, done. Okay. So I was webmaster and humanist philosopher for the International Federation of Secular and Humanistic Judaism. I then told him I was about to move to D.C. He said, fine, that's even more fantastic. We'd love to have the offices of the International Federation for Secular and Humanistic Judaism be in D.C. right next to the national offices for the AHA. And so there I was. And so I did that for a number of years. And so it took me a little while to find the Washington Ethical Society. But finally, Tom is running around. He's saying, okay, I now need to start thinking about for the kids, and what are we going to do for the kids? What are we going to teach them? So he finally wanders in to the Washington Ethical Society. And he comes back and he says, Dad, you have to come here and look at this. You are going to love it. And so I walk in, and I did. And so we joined 3 generations all at one time. And so that was wonderful. So at the Washington Ethical Society, which at that point had joined the Unitarians, had a joint membership with the Unitarians and the ethical culture, and Ed Erickson had been leader there quite some time ago. And Arthur has met Ed, I'm pretty sure. But so there they have a bookcase of books for sale, right? And so as you're looking there and saying, okay, so what are we'd like to know more about the history of American religious humanism. So they have a book there that says, okay, you want to know about that? Here it is, right here, okay? So this is a book called American Religious Humanism by Mason Olds. Now there's only one problem with this book, and it does talk a little bit about the American Humanist Association and ethical culture, but it's really saying, you know what? American religious humanism is all inside the Unitarian Church. Okay? And so, he didn't put that on the title, but he really should have. But as a humanist philosopher, I'm starting to say, you know what, we really need to. Well, and I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at the Washington Ethical Society. At this point, I don't think I caused this to happen at all, but just outside the Washington Ethical Society, which has this wonderful building, they have a plaque that says, "A vibrant humanistic congregation." Right? And actually I was a little surprised by that, because when I'd studied Felix Adler, I'd read that Felix Adler didn't like the term humanism. Right? He thought that humanism was too individualistic, too much of a philosophy, and he said, look, congregations are about people getting together, and so you need something that is about people getting together, and we don't want to be too individualistic. And but here we are at Ethical Culture, but they're claiming that they're a vibrant humanistic congregation. And so I'm sitting here and I'm seeing how much. I'm looking at the Washington Ethical Society, and I say, oh, the Washington Ethical Society is a humanist megachurch, okay? And that's the way I thought of it. That, they are substantially larger, they have a lot more money than the Humanist Community does. But in some sense, that was what I was trying to help build here. But they're there, they've got it, it's running, so I'm saying, okay, here I am, at a very strong center of religious humanism, and this is just great for me. I want to help move them forward. But then I'm looking at that, and I said, you know what? The problem is that the people at the Washington Ethical Society, because they have now come to embrace humanism as part of what ethical culture is, it turns out at this point in time. So there's no longer the conflict that some people thought there was in the early days of ethical culture. So I'm sitting there saying, you know what, we've got this book here, but the people in the congregation could really use something that tells them more about the history of the real history of religious humanism. And the real history of religious humanism cannot be, you cannot pretend that it doesn't include anything about the American Humanist Association. Right? That's just not correct, okay? And yet many of the histories have done that. Why? Because we do not have enough of our communities declaring themselves strongly to be religious humanist communities, and therefore writing histories about the religious humanism within the American Humanist Association, okay? And so I got picked for that, okay? So that's what I'm in the process of doing. And so a year ago, I got this project. I said, okay, and so I'm looking around, I'm saying, what happened in religious humanism in the 20th century? I said, you know what? Something happened in 1962. And I'm sitting there, I call Arthur up on the phone, I say, Arthur, what happened in 1962? And he mumbles something, and I don't even remember what he said at this moment, because at that moment I did not get the answer to my question, okay? And so I'm sitting back there and I said, well, I know something happened, and it was right around the time that Rabbi Sherwin Wein was starting humanistic Judaism, but I didn't think that was the end of the story by any means. I know it was part of it, but it wasn't the end of the story by any means. So I start saying, I got to find out what it is, okay? And so I start thinking, I sit back and I say, well, wait a minute. The Humanist Community was founded about that time. So presumably, the founding of the humanist community is part of this, okay? And so I finally said, okay, well, if the founding of the humanist community is part of this, then the place where I need some archival records of what was going on in the American Humanist Association in 1962, and I wonder if Arthur has some archival records of what was going on here at the humanist community. And so I put together this project that I executed last year, where I spent 2 weeks with Arthur, interviewing him and poring over the newsletters that he has going all the way back to 1969. Okay? And then after that, I traveled to Chicago, where we have the Meadville Lombard Unitarian Seminary, and they happen to have the archival papers of the American Humanist Association. They also have some of Arthur Jackson. They have some from Lloyd Moraine. And so I said, okay, I'm going to look at those archival papers. Now, it turns out there is another wonderful book. Oh, actually, there are a couple of other wonderful books that are close to being primary source materials, because the people who wrote them were heavily involved in religious humanism. And one of them is, from the AHA, is the Genesis of a Humanist Manifesto by Edwin H. Wilson. So many of you may know that Edwin H. Wilson is one of our older leaders within the American Humanist Association. He was executive director from 1949 to 1963. And so I said, oh, my God. Well, at any rate. So he doesn't mention exactly when he stopped in here, because this book isn't about the history of humanism, but it does have a little bit at the beginning that says a little bit about it. The other major book that talks about the history of American religious humanism is Howard Redest's book, but he is writing it for ethical culture. And so when he gives you the title of his book, the title of his book is not this kind of thing. It's something that lets you know that it's about the history of ethical culture. Again, the societies, this is all the societies within ethical culture. But he has a really nice section at the beginning that does an even better job than Mason Old's book does of covering the history before the formation of ethical culture, which was in 1876, by the way, is when Felix Adler created ethical culture. So at any rate, so I'm sitting here saying, okay, so what are all these things what are the big things that happen? So after I've done all my research, I finally figured out, okay, you know what? There were 4 major things that happened around 1962. It turns out, in June of 1960, the AHA sponsors a humanist symposium on metaphysics with Sir Julian Huxley, which is then edited by Corliss Lamont. So Corliss Lamont was part of this symposium. There are 3 other humanists. And I couldn't find the actual published papers from that symposium, but it turns out that Julian Huxley, in 1961, publishes The Humanist Frame, which is his second major book on religious humanism, because he wrote like the original book on religious humanism from 1925 called Religion Without Revelation, which has an entire chapter on how you can have revelations as a humanist. Okay? But so he publishes The Humanist Frame, and he's promptly named Humanist of the Year, partly for that work. So that's one of the things that happened, is we've got Julian Huxley writing The Humanist Frame. Then, in addition, we have Rabbi Sherwin-Wine establishing the Birmingham Temple in 1963, which is his temple of Jewish temple. He had been ordained as a Reform rabbi, but he then rapidly formed humanistic Judaism. And some of his friends he had 2 friends who formed other synagogues of humanistic Judaism throughout the United States. One, I think it was it's either Cincinnati, I think it's Cleveland, but it might be Cincinnati. But the other one is in Washington, D.C. And so I got to visit the one in Washington, D.C. It was absolutely fascinating. Could not get them to join the International Federation of Secular and Humanistic Judaism, however. I couldn't get either one of them to do it. All right, well, at any rate, and so that was the second thing that happened. The big thing that happens is, as I mentioned, Edwin H. Wilson decides to retire in 1963. All right? It turns out that's important. And the last thing that I realized is, you know what? This was the 60s. Now, I don't know how many of you remember what was actually going on in the 60s, but we're talking about Synanon. We're talking about Esalen. We're talking about humanistic psychology, which was very big. It turns out there was a big issue that was developing in psychology was the whole idea that you could help people with their sexual problems. There was this whole sex therapy that was rather new. It was post Masters and Johnson. And so that was an important part of the humanistic psychology. And then thinking for yourself was also very important for everyone throughout the 60s. And there was this thing called encounter. And I don't really know what encounter is, but Arthur has done a lot of leading of it, and Roy knows a lot about it, and some of you, especially the older people, know a lot more about it than I know. And but it's much more involved with subjective life, and it really doesn't have much to do with thinking about the objective world and how it works. All right, so those were the four big elements that stimulated religious humanism in the early 60s. And so then it seemed to me it was interesting to find out, okay, so what is going on with Ed Wilson? All right, so I started following that. So it turns out that the story of Ed Wilson really starts when he settles in. It turns out the American Humanist Association was moving around quite a bit during the 40s, from one place to another, Utah, all kinds of places. They finally settled in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and I'm pretty sure Ed Wilson helped them settle in Yellow Springs, Ohio, because he became their executive director in 1949. The first record I have of them being in Yellow Springs is 1950. In 1951, just to let you know some of what was Ed Wilson thinking about, he creates a radio address that's transmitted over NBC, and he turns it into a pamphlet called The Fourth Faith. All right? So you can see that Ed Wilson really is a religious humanist. Okay? But he's executive director of the American Humanist Association, and religion within the American Humanist Association is not as strong. Okay? In 1957, he starts saying, you know, wouldn't it be great? Here we are, we've settled in Yellow Springs, Ohio. We've been here like for, over 7 years now. We need a building. And so he starts plans for building a building in Yellow Springs, Ohio. In 1960, construction is underway on the new building, and they call it the Humanist House. Also, about this time, the president of AHA, for a while, this person by the name of George Axtell is the president. And so he gives a talk on a religion for the future, in which he says, "It is my belief, ... Thus, our future requires a religion which incorporates and integrates the moving forces of our time. This is to say, it must reflect democracy, science, our economic and industrial life, and the arts and our cosmopolitan world." So that's just part of what was going on. So this whole issue of religious humanism or just being secular was very much of an issue, with plenty of people within the American Humanist Association saying, no, you know what, this is a religion. Okay? But not all of them. Okay. So in 1961, Ed Wilson creates a humanist group manual for our local chapters, and he declares our local chapters are educational in purpose rather than ecclesiastical, because we're cooperating with ethical societies, Unitarian Universalist churches, and some Quaker and Jewish groups that are of a naturalistic element. So those are the ones doing religious humanism. we are educating people so that they will want to go, so that those groups will be more humanistic, and so that people will go to those groups and when they want a religion. So that was Ed Wilson's basic idea. And so he wanted to say, no, within the AHA, we're going to be more educational, we're not going to be religious, because we really don't want to compete with our friends in the ethical culture and Unitarians and the Quakers and the humanistic Jewish people. Okay, and at this point, the humanistic Jewish people hadn't broken away, and well, as a matter of fact, the Birmingham Temple hadn't even gotten started yet. Okay, so, but then, so Ed Wilson is busy working away to organize things from a national standpoint. So he comes up with this concept of a humanist counselor. His concept of the humanist counselor is that we need these people who will be regional leaders. And they will be operating in regions, and they will help establish humanist chapters and councils that will then coordinate with the various churches and whatnot. And so that's what the idea is. And he's got 3 of them who are really high on his list of, these are some really good humanist counselors. Their names are, one of them is Tolbert McCarroll, who is president of the Oregon Ethical Study Society in Portland. Robert McCoy of Minneapolis, Minnesota, who, at Ed Wilson's urging, had been working to secure the parole of Joseph Redenbaugh, who had become famous as the genius in cell block 2. And so they were trying to get him a job so that he would come out of jail and get on parole. They would only parole him if he could have a job and stuff like that. And then Stuart Paul of Chicago, who in 1962 convinced the Third Unitarian Church of Chicago to affiliate with the AHA. Of course, they'd published the Humanist magazine in the 1930s. Okay. So, so in June of 1962, Ed Wilson announces his desire to retire. And he completes his and he announces his concept of humanist counselors to the AHA, and adds 3 additional counselors to these: one in Toronto, Canada, one in Cleveland, and one in Albuquerque. And at this time, Ed is talking in general terms with both McCarroll, McCoy, and Paul about his plans to retire, and he's trying to find someone to replace him. So in October 1962, his plans for retirement are barreling along, and so the board of directors pretty much settles on Tolbert McCarroll as the guy who's going to replace him. And Ed writes them a little thing and said, well, if you'd asked me who I recommended, I would have recommended Tolbert, but I also would have recommended McCoy and Paul, and let you figure out which one of those 3 you wanted. So, Tolbert McCarroll becomes the new executive director in July 1963. He immediately decides to reconstruct the Humanist Counselor program based upon the experiences of the spiritual counselors of the Dutch Humanist League. And he creates a working, because they had a working party on humanist counseling in the 1962 International Humanist and Ethical Union meeting, Congress in Oslo. And he also changes the bylaws of the AHA to include a section on humanist counselors and establish the chapter of humanist counselors. And so then he writes a letter. And so it turns out in 1964, he's finally ready to do the first training program for humanist counselors using his new concept. And so it turns out that there's only a few people who went. The most outstanding student in that first thing was Arthur Jackson. Okay. And So after that, Arthur acted as a citizen sponsor at the Oregon State Correctional Institute, and he helped form several humanist groups in the Pacific Northwest, because he was from Oregon. Okay. And then in March of 1965, Art Rogers, who was had some kind of connection here in San Jose. He writes a paper called The Human Needs of Humanists, which to me sounds a lot like a religious humanist kind of thing. And he says, in San Jose, we have groups discussing the art of loving, the challenge of parenthood, interpersonal relations, Jesus as a humanist, and the search for meaning. So that was something that was going on. That was in 1965. And so Ed Wilson is retiring, and so as he retires, he creates a new organization, the Fellowship of Religious Humanists, and he decides to start publishing a new quarterly journal, the Journal of Religious Humanism, which continues to exist today. And the purpose is to deal with religious trends from the naturalistic point of view, and to encourage humanistic tendencies within liberal religious organizations such as Unitarian churches and ethical societies. But then in April of 1965, Tolbert McCarroll decides to hire Arthur on staff at the American Humanist Association. And he does so, and he says, look, come join us on staff at the American Humanist, and then you can help me with the next counseling session. And so Arthur is there. McCarroll thinks he's helping with the next counseling session. As I talked to Arthur about it, he doesn't remember helping that much with that. But he remembers benefiting from it. So this was his second humanist counseling. This time we really get Dr. Rudolf Dreikers very strongly involved. He's an Adlerian psychologist. 16-hour workshop with 5 to 8 participants. Techniques of working with groups and individuals, psychology of memorial services, dynamic of family, and he agrees to work with the AHA on an ongoing basis. At this point, Tolbert McCarroll says, okay, we have now experimented with our new program of humanist counselors, and so now we're going to turn it operational. And in order to do that, I really want Arthur, well, we've now hired Arthur and Arthur's now moved to Yellow Springs, Ohio. So we're going to name Arthur one of the assistant directors of the American Humanist Association. However, as they're describing, what is he actually doing? Well, he's chairman of the chapter of counselors in training, and he's also chief of operations at Humanist House in Yellow Springs. So Arthur writes a position paper number 3 on humanist leadership, partly about the counselor program. Tolbert McCarroll writes a paper on procedures for humanist weddings. And Tolbert McCarroll had some background as a lawyer, so he knew some of these more lawyerly things, and so he makes sure that all that is included in what he puts in on his stuff. All right, well, at any rate, so I need to skip over some of this stuff. It turns out that in addition to the Humanist Counselor Program, which is, of all the things that Tolbert McCarroll did, that is the thing that has remained his legacy within the American Humanist Association, because the Humanist Counseling Program as we have it today derives directly from what McCarroll got started and does not follow what Ed Wilson was talking about. Okay? All right. In addition, Tolbert McCarroll had this idea of a Humanist Institute. And he also really wanted to move the offices from Yellow Springs, Ohio to San Francisco. He says, look, San Francisco is a bigger place. This is where the 60s are really happening, is in San Francisco. We need to be in San Francisco. And so he plays an important role in the 1966 International Humanist and Ethical Union, and he takes Arthur with him when they go there, and comes back convinced that they have to move to San Francisco even more strongly. And he says, and in San Francisco will be the great place to start the Humanist Institute. And of course, his idea of the Humanist Institute is, I'll get up to that in a minute. Okay. No, I've got it right here. No, I don't have time for that. That's all right. But it's not the current concept of the Humanist Institute. So his concept of the Humanist Institute eventually dies and gets reborn, okay, in a different form, sort of the way the Humanist Counselor Ed Wilson's concept died, and Tolbert McCarroll's form is the one that we have today. Okay, so so they decided to sell the Humanist House to the Fellowship of Religious Humanists, and they moved to San Francisco. This Carlos Lamont does not like this very well, and so I'm noticing that the membership of the board of directors and the meetings of the board of directors after the move seldom has Carlos Lamont there. And exactly when he was on and off the board is completely unclear to me, although I have enough records that I photocopied that it might be in there somewhere. It's just that as I was preparing for this talk and during this last week, I wasn't able to find it. But one of the things I do have is, I don't know how many of you have heard of a guy by the name of Robert Erdman, but it turns out he was a key, Roy knows Robert. Alex, you remember Robert? No. I'm not sure Alex met him. But he was a very early, very significant leader in the humanist community of San Jose. But he'd become a member of the board of directors of the American Humanist Association. He was helping them raise money for the American Humanist Association. But he really liked Tolbert McCarroll, and because Tolbert McCarroll was good at organizing stuff, and the young guys at the AHA seemed to like McCarroll and where he was going. His concept of Tolbert McCarroll had this very strong concept that humanism should be religious humanism, and that should be happening within the American Humanist Association. But he knew he had to deal with Carlos Lamont, and so he was doing his best to deal with him. But he really wanted to move the headquarters away from Carlos Lamont, not toward him. Okay, and so so in 1968, the plans for the Humanist Institute are gelling. They're deciding to cooperate with Esalen, Venture, Diggers, Next Step. The most important is a network of encounter groups, seminars, festivals, and related experiential activities, leading to a scheme of religion by the year 2000. And when they sell the Humanist House to the Fellowship of Humanities, they decide that the term Humanist House will remain with the American Humanist Association, and so their new offices in San Francisco will be called Humanist House instead of what was originally built as Humanist House, which now is owned by the Fellowship of Religious Humanists. Okay. So, all right. So anyway, so what happens is right around this time, as they're getting ready for the human, and Bob Erdman and Scott Beach are both certified as humanist counselors right at this time. And then they decided, and Tolbert says, you know what, we really need to incorporate the Humanist Institute as a separate organization. And then in addition, as I'm looking around, as I talk to Arthur, there's something about changing the incorporation of the American Humanist Association itself to make it religious. I have not been able to nail that down in the AHA documents, but there is one place where Paul Kurtz is having this conversation saying, well, couldn't we make it educational and religious? And I think that's in response to Tolbert McCarroll saying, we're going to change this to religious, to a religious tax exemption, okay? And Arthur's talking about and saying, well, what about, we might lose our tax exemption the way National Geographic did, and I don't know what that's all about. But at any rate, and so how much of it was a change of incorporation about becoming a religious organization, and how much of it was the change of just incorporating the Humanist Institute, because there was a lot of support for the Humanist Institute among a lot of people at the time. But in any case, with all this, too many of the leaders in AA, and then also they're running out of money. They're running out of money at the AHA. Because with all these moves and one thing and another, and I don't know how well Tolbert McCarroll was getting along with Carlos Lamont, probably not as well as he should have been. And so what was one thing and another, they're having money problems. And so what was one thing and another, the board decides that it is time to Tolbert McCarroll to go. And this is at the end of 1968 we're talking about. So right around this time, as they're all deciding this, Carlos Lamont has a little chat with Arthur, and he says, so Arthur, what are your plans? Because everyone knew that Arthur was a loyal lieutenant to Tolbert McCarroll. And so Arthur is sitting there, and it sounded as if Carlos was not talking and saying, well, everyone knows you're a loyal lieutenant of Tolbert, therefore you have to go too. He wasn't doing it that way at all. He was just saying, hey, what are your plans? So I think he felt, hey, Arthur is perfectly capable of being a loyal lieutenant to whoever is in charge. But he asked Arthur, and Arthur said, you know what? From my standpoint, I feel that we have to get these chapters going. So I want to spend my time helping to build chapters and figure out how to do chapters inside the American Humanist Association. Meanwhile, Robert Erdman is saying, you know what, we need paid staff here in the humanist community, because that's how you really need to do this. You need some paid staff in order to make it work. It's getting too much for us. And they didn't even have 100 people at the time. And so in January 1969, Robert Erdman sends out a mailing to the humanist community and said, hey, we have an opportunity. We need to hire someone. We're going to ask national office to send us someone. Our first pick is Arthur Jackson. But he says, but maybe if they won't give us Arthur, maybe they'll give us someone else. And he names someone else. And furthermore, Stan Head, who was a wonderful member of the community at the time, he says he has already volunteered to provide housing. So he'll provide housing for whoever it is we get from national. So that, and so that's in January. In March, Arthur is hired as executive director of the American Humanist Association. And at that same moment, McCarroll resigns, effective April 1st. And by this point, Robert Erdman has resigned from the board of directors of the American Humanist Association. And both McCarroll, and the president at the time was Bob McCoy, so he was one of those other three guys. He'd been the president during this whole time of McCarroll. They were both the representatives to the International Humanist and Ethical Union from the American Humanist Association. They get replaced with Lloyd Moraine and Paul Kurtz. Paul Kurtz had just recently joined the board of directors during McCarroll's time there. And so HCSJ has now two humanist counselors who can perform humanist weddings, Arthur Jackson and Robert Erdman. And so in May 1969, Arthur is busy creating the HCSJ newsletter, as I remember it. And so it then evolved into something much more elaborate. But in those days, it was pretty simple. But simple, but very effective. All right. So the interesting thing is that we have numerous records of the Humanist Institute actually operating in this area. The Humanist Community did some joint programs with the Humanist Institute, various meetings and events during the early 70s. There's a lot of people that go to the IHEU meeting in 1970. In 1970, the Humanist Community reaches 100 members. By September of 1970, they have 100 families, as that meeting a goal set by the HCSJ Executive Committee. And then in November, Arthur marries Linda Janowitz, with Robert Erdman officiating. Linda becomes a humanist counselor herself. Hank Bassain, who is a member of the who's a humanist psychologist. He leads 2 6-week sessions to train facilitators and encounter leaders. Lisa Kalvalich was one of our members, and she she suggested that we start a registry of conscientious objectors. We start that, and it's not long before the local draft boards are saying, okay, you're a humanist conscientious objector, the HCSJ has you on their registry, therefore you are a conscientious objector. And then, and so things are going along rather nicely. They have a special event with Dr. Albert Ellis, Sex Without Guilt, at San Jose State College, and a workshop on rational motive therapy. This is a huge success. 400 people attend, and it raises $450 after expenses. And then there's they sponsor B.F. Skinner at San Jose State College in 1972, and so they fill 1,080 seats at San Jose State and 150 overflow, and that generates $600 in profit. Because part of what was going on now is they said, okay, you know, and for a while he was living with Stan Head. By this time he's moved out of Stan Head's house and he's got his own place. But they said, but you know, the problem is we're not sure where the money is coming to pay you to be executive director. And so Arthur was really working hard to raise money in any way he possibly could. And so these events were actually wonderful ways, very much in line with all the goals of the humanist community. But he's just having to raise a lot of money because he's trying to do that. And in the meantime, he's busy adding a lot of money to the building fund. And so it turns out that Skinner at this talk donates his entire $1,000 speaking fee to the Humanist Community Building Fund, which is now at $4,700 at that point in May 1972. And then Arthur gets this great idea. He says, let's have a humanist Renaissance festival. Okay? And so this is 1972. And so they decide to put on a humanist Renaissance festival at Hidden Villa Ranch in Los Gatos. And, I'm sorry, the first one is in 1971. All right, where's that? Here we are. 1971, he does that. 400 people gathered, and all the food and beverages were sold. They said, that was wonderful. In 1972, they said, we're going to do it again. This time they say, okay, let's make it more elaborate. We're going to get more people. We're going to have fire eaters, jugglers, puppet show, mimes. It's going to be an expanded event. They get 1,000 people this time and 1,500 people on Sunday. We could have used at least twice as many volunteer workers. So they're raising a total of about $1,000 from all of that. This is again at Hidden Villa. But then in in September 1972, Arthur and Linda start calling their house Humanist House. And I think someone makes, I'm not sure at what point someone makes a sign that they put on their house that says Humanist House. Okay. All right. Programs include more about sexuality, massage, encounter, that kind of stuff. January 1973, we have the Humanist Alternative TV show that starts showing on KTEH TV in our area. And so this is related to Paul Kurtz's book called The Humanist Alternative. Kurtz is heavily involved in the creation of this TV show. Linda Jackson is appointed to the board of directors in 1973. And then in July 1973, the newsletter has this wonderful photo of Arthur and Linda in costume for the Humanist Renaissance Festival for 1973. Ladies and knights, look to the glade, and now we're talking the Santa Clara Convention Center. So this is the glade at the Santa Clara Convention Center. And so they have another one the next year, and then HCSA hosts a regional conference in 1974 because Humanist Manifesto 2 is just starting. And HCSA decides, hey, we want to help gather 1 million signatures for Humanist Manifesto 2, and as a result of HCSJ doing that, all the AHA says, you know what, that's a great thing, but that needs to be done nationally because, HCS, are they really going to get 1 million people just in the San Francisco Bay Area? Well, that needs to be a nationwide effort, so we're going to do a nationwide effort. I found the book in the archives that has 1 million signatures for Humanist Manifesto 2. So that was a successful project. And then, so there's another great success in August 1974. And Linda and Arthur go off to Europe for the 6th International Humanist and Ethical Union. And Arthur chairs the working party that's developing the counseling programs in the member countries. And so right around this time, and I forgot to mention that back in 1970 is when my mother started working on the Ode on Reason and Faith. And I'd started working on my creed in 1973. So right around June of 1975 is when I declared that I finished working on my creed. I'm all done with it. I'm still back at MIT, doing work there. I've read The Humanist Alternative by this time and that kind of stuff, and the Corliss Lamont's philosophy of humanism, all that stuff. Okay. Then we have 1976, the Humanist Renaissance Festival, and so that doesn't work out quite as well, but it's not. All right, which one? No. There's the June of 1976. Now, 1976. Does anyone remember what was so special about 1976? It was the bicentennial. Okay, and so there's some thought that maybe there was a competing event, but then Arthur thinks that it was canceled. But in any case, with one thing and another, the Renaissance Festival did not go nearly as well. And so, and then they try to have a Christmas event also, which then also they actually lose money on the Christmas event. I think they didn't actually lose money on the June 1976 festival, but they lose money on the Christmas thing, and so then in January they say, we have a crisis right now. We can no longer afford a paid executive director. Arthur is leaving January 1, 1977. It turns out Stephen Bishop was born in February of 1977. So and that was here. But I was still working on my doctorate at the time, so I flew out for his birth, and then I flew back to MIT. So I had not connected to the humanist community yet. Okay. So, when they stop paying Arthur, Arthur says, well, all right, you're not going to pay me. I guess I'll do something else. And so he goes off and he does something else. And so the humanist community starts struggling. They start saying, okay, how can we recover? Fortunately, they have a dynamic leader, Glenn Hubbard. But he feels himself personally responsible for some of these decisions that had been made about losing the various amounts of money. And so he's not feeling good. And so we get a new president, Liz Chevelle, in March of 1977, but then she decides that she wants to be a lawyer, and so she leaves in July of 1977. And they say, we need a new president, a new treasurer, and so they've wound up with Roz Douglas as the new president, but she says, I really don't want to be president. I need someone else to help me be president. But in the meantime, Glenn Hubbard he started doing something else. He says, hey, in August of 1977, we need a Humanist Counselor Summer Institute here in Los Gatos. And so he organizes that at the Los Gatos Lodge. And this is the second year it's been done. And so, again, humanist community becomes a center of humanist counselor support and organizing for all of the American Humanist Association. And so this is right around the time that Catherine and I join. And things go on this way, with Liz sort of being around a little bit for some of this time, but because I remember her rather well, being a leader, but I remember her leaving also. But then, probably in 1979, Sam Fogel comes to me and says, you know what, because by this time I was a new member, and people knew that I was really interested in helping the humanist community. And so Sam comes to me and says, look, we're going to give up the incorporation for the humanist community. But before we do that, we want to make sure that no one else, we're all burned out. We cannot do this anymore. And so we need to find someone else who is going to do this. And so I'm coming to, and Peter, you know, I think you would like Arthur. So why don't you go talk to Arthur? Okay. And so I tell him that, hey, I'd be happy to help, but I don't remember going off and talking to Arthur at that moment. What I remember and what the documentary evidence tells us is that in June of 1979, so the board contacts Arthur, is what happens. They contact Arthur, and so Arthur says, well, all right, so how much time do I have? Cut it up as soon as possible, right? Okay.
5 minutes, maybe.
5 minutes, okay, good. So at any rate, so what happens is we get things started. Turns out that my mom finishes the ode in about December of 1979. I immediately start a Sunday school, so Sheila Pastore and I help Arthur get things started again, okay? And we get it started on the skeleton of what was left, and so it's not long before we've got 50 members, and then Arthur is working hard. He's creating newsletters again. We've told him, yes, we want you to become the executive director, but he says, but wait a minute, we only have 50 members, so how much can you pay me? And so we said, well, we promise we will pay you as soon as we can. And he says, well, all right. And at least I've got some people helping me. And so I start running a Sunday school. Okay. So in 1981, so 1980 was a pretty exciting year, because this is now a little after this. The newsletter is now containing, it's not just calendar, it's also got some discussions, it's a little bit like a magazine. So I published my Story of Thanksgiving, which is just a children's story about Thanksgiving in the newsletter. The humanist counselors get a joint yellow page listing with the humanist community, because we finally are able to buy a telephone for Arthur that's a humanist community telephone, and the humanist community decides to put an entry for itself into the yellow pages under the heading Churches Humanist, with a 1-inch ad and a listing under Churches Non-Denominational without just an entry. And Art gets selected to the AHA Board of Directors. I publish my creed in the Humanist magazine. I start giving talks. One of my talks in 81 is Machine Intelligence, the Possible and the Practical. And at that point, Arthur comes out with his first cut at the Humanist chapter of the Future in the Future of AHA. And Frank Morton, who's from LA, he has his own thing that's along those lines called Super Chapters, but it's only 2 pages long, but it is built on Arthur's ideas. Okay. And then in 1986, we finally decide to start paying Arthur. We name him as the part-time executive director in 1986. Because we've gotten big enough, we can finally afford something. Now, I seem to remember we got started a little earlier than that, but we weren't paying him much because we really couldn't afford much. All right, well,